And we're live. Just like everything else going on today, the country's falling apart. Microphones aren't acting properly. Things are in a tizzy, but I've got an amazing guest. Dr. Michael Wood, how you doing?
I'm great. Very happy for you to have me and interested to see where this discussion will go.
Yeah, I'm interested too. And actually, I've already got a comment in. The person who asked that I bring you on is Eva. And thank you for the super chat, Eva. Eva is a fan of you and your show. And she actually recommended and said, hey, can you get him on? And I contacted you and brought you on. So I want to get her questions right out the gate. And then I do want to diverge because we kind of have to talk about what the hell's going on and what maybe police tactics would be used or good or bad or what you think, considering our rather odd situation, which I never thought I'd see. So Eva's asking, I'm a family member of a person with a severe mental illness. As an advocate for families like mine, I experienced many instances where a call for help ends badly or tragically. And then only a small percentage of police receives crisis intervention training. And what can we as family members do and advocate for to keep our loved ones as safe as possible from police? And what are some reformative messages that our police and justice system can undergo to make our society destigmatize and decriminalize mental illness? So there's a load right in there, right out the gate. So go. No.
Yeah, of course. Solve world peace and then tell no one.
Oh, okay.
I think basically we're kind of hitting on one key issue from the beginning, which is the idea between freedom and liberty versus the risk that you want to absorb. So as a society, there is a balancing act between the level of liberty and trust we want to have as the community to handle things themselves, and then the power that we want to invest in the state. Typically, I want to steer us away from investing power into the state as the sole arbiter of violence and a legal way to execute violence on something. When it comes to particularly dealing with the mental health issue, I would stand strongly behind the belief that police officers are simply not capable of being properly trained to handle mental illnesses and the results, especially when you're in the middle of a violent episode. And I'm not really sure anyone's going to be able to be trained in a way that would make everybody happy and to maximize safety. I would advocate, and I think other people should advocate, for policing that more closely aligns structurally with what the community wants and the decisions that the community wants to make about those decisions versus somebody like me coming in and telling you what you should do. Now, if you decide you want police officers there, I can advise you and I can have a discussion on what it would be like to have police officers there. And I can give you my opinion. My opinion is basically you're going to always need an armed officer in situations that are potentially violent. Vast majority of police officers are physically and mentally incapable of dealing with that situation when the shit hits the fan, so to say. And I think basic civilians are generally going to be very poor at handling those situations as well. I basically would say you need people to stand on walls and you need people to kill other people when the time comes. But you want to restrict that to the most narrow window possible. And when it comes to mental illness, that's such a broad category. I'm not even sure I buy into the concept completely of mental illnesses. I would think we're all on some kind of spectrum and we can all jump into these things immediately. To think that because someone has behaved a certain way 99.9% of their lives, that they won't behave the way you're not expecting in the 0.1% of the time is very naive. I am very capable of having a mental breakdown come out of nowhere. It could be through being poisoned. It could be through some kind of biological and hormonal change. And I could go out and I could kill somebody tomorrow. There was no proper way to plan for that.
Okay, so hope for the best and try to prepare for the worst. But yeah, I admit that's a really loaded series of questions out the gate, and my audience does come up with edge cases that can be difficult, which I'm happy with. your stance, and I kind of wanted to get a journey to get where you are, because I feel like when you were on with Rogan and stuff, you kind of had a stance, and maybe you stated it one way and it wasn't interpreted correctly, or I feel like you shifted over time.
I get that I've shifted from a lot of people over time, and I'm going to insist that my principles are absolutely 100% the same. And it's really the changes in the questions that I'm being asked. Before 4 or 5 years ago, people were asking me questions about systemic racism. And systemic racism within police departments, so institutional racism. And I would refer to these things as the echoes of a past. It's not an intentional action now. These are things that are in the system in certain cities, such as redlining, such as welfare systems, locking people in, different geography-based issues, lead poisoning, poor politics in an area, things like that, that have the echoes throughout an institution. And I would say something like just the mere fact that this is definitely a sidetrack too, but the mere fact that we are often trying to portray policing as responding to demographics, and police respond to violence. And what I really want to point out is that when police respond to violence, yes, they are catching up nonviolent drug offenders. They are catching up prostitutes. They are catching up minor offenders in the same geographies as violence. What I want to point out is that those people who are being arrested for low-level offenses, they're there innocently from the community because they've asked the police to come respond to violence. And then police have a system that judges them and incentivizes them to go out and make arrests. Well, police can only arrest what they can actually see. So when the police respond to violence in a high violence neighborhood, yes, there's essentially double victimization of the regular people that live in that neighborhood. Now, when I say Black Lives Matter and we talk about police reforms, these are the things I'm talking about. When the discussion has changed over the last 4 years to cops are racist, whoa, I never said that. Police are not racist. If anything, they have sometimes have racial outcomes, racially biased outcomes, but that's not due to their intent. Racism is intent. Yeah, there's a big difference between intent and the way things can come out inadvertently. So there is a reason that the cops are catching double victims. And it's the fact that 12.7% of the population is committing 53% of the murders. If you can't acknowledge that and realize that significant parts of our racially disproportionate things that happen in policing are due to this staggering fact of one group of people committing 420% more violence than everybody else, you're being dishonest in your argument at best.
Okay, well, and a lot of that too, and maybe I'm wrong, I feel like we focus a lot more on race when we really should be looking at class. And yes. I bring this up because I'm actually originally from Arizona. And I will tell you, a trailer park in Arizona is one of the most dangerous places on the planet. And the police have no problems knocking heads around in a trailer park in Arizona. And everybody in there is generally Caucasian.
Right. So it's state violence. There's
all kinds of crime there, and the police come in and they don't hold back. But I don't feel like this violence is necessarily covered. I do feel like there are agendas out there, and some violence is ignored and some violence is enhanced.
It's not covered. Twice as many white unarmed people are killed by police. I mean, I have videos of these same things happening and nobody cares. That's why when they think, when, like you say, that this kind of idea that I've changed, well, when I wanted to show empathy for poor Black people, that same empathy is supposed to exist for poor white people and poor Asian people. I mean, poor Asian people are told they can't go to college because of the way they look. That's mind blowing. So those kind of forms of racism are everywhere. And I've really found that intentional racism is wholly on the left. And so when I point that out, it starts to cause a problem about what we're saying. I just can't believe that we can even have a discussion about policing when you're telling me that the young Black kid who grew up in Baltimore, who dreamed his whole life and heard everyone around him say, if you want to do things better, join the police department, make sure that things change. And then they stay out of trouble. They work their lives and they become Baltimore City police officers, and they go out onto that street. And the first thing that's going to happen is some white kid from the county is going to call him a racist. I can't, I just can't.
Yeah, well, I mean, that makes sense. But again, I don't know, where the stance is, etc. And that's why I'm talking, because I'm wide open. Some of the things I've heard you mention, I've tried to catch up on interviews and the like over a short period. And I've had a philosophy that I would love to see cops actually live in their precinct. And
I don't disagree. So I hear a lot of police reform ideas, and I pretty much disagree with all of them, because they tend to be trying to fix a ship that's going in the wrong direction, essentially. It's about trying to mitigate something that's already wrong, and I want to change our core philosophies about what we're talking to acknowledge that we are talking about comply or die when it comes to police. We are talking about the state use of violence, and it's a monopoly on that violence for it to be justified. And we're talking about emotional human beings carrying out these actions. And I think that should really be limited as much as possible. And the really weird thing that comes up is when you're talking about cops living in their neighborhood, it's something like that makes sense. But human beings and the way we interact with society just almost always never actually makes sense when you look at the data. Most things end up being counterintuitive. The reason I'm going to say I'm against officers that are from the neighborhood is I'm just envisioning simply as an anecdotal account of myself being, what would I act like if my friends were the criminals that I grew up with? The neighbors that I would be trying to protect. I get the idea that you could maybe minimize state violence a little bit, but I think that really depends on the individual. And as a group, you're going to be talking about more corruption taking place in that gang and that interfamiliar thing. When people become police officers, they do stand aside from the rest of society to think, yeah, they come from society, but to think they are society is just not a reality of what takes place. You are essentially recruited from the lower classes to become police. And what they end up doing is they take you out of the lower classes, push you kind of monetarily into the middle class. And then your power is the power of the elites. You don't get speeding tickets, you don't get parking tickets. Dumb shit isn't usually something that you have to worry about. So the laws apply to you like the elites, and you bumped out of your lower class. So to expect those general type of people to act and behave like everybody else, I think is a misunderstanding of basic human nature. And you're never going to get people with the power to take lives, to see the world like everyone else. The amount of trauma that we see, the amount of bullshit that we deal with when you're dealing with human beings pretty much at their worst your entire career, and you're mostly dealing with people that you're not only it's like the worst moment of their lives is when you're interacting with them and your first impressions of them. These things just dramatically change who you are as a person, and those people will never be our neighbor like we think they can be.
Okay, that's interesting, and I didn't think about it that way. I guess I was thinking in terms of you don't shit where you eat, but at the same token,
cops tend to.
Okay, you're kind of describing, and it popped in my head right away. I was like, oh yeah, it is sort of like the Irish roots in New York and Boston, and the people who are from the hood staying in the hood, and they're going to have all the grudges and everything else from their childhood going forward. Okay, so that sort of makes sense in that.
So that's why I always want to talk about how it's weird and counterintuitive for things like if you want to buy into the racial worldview, which I do not. Race is not real. It is not scientific. It was invented not that long ago. No one should be talking about race as an actual real thing. It's just...
But ironically, race was invented to help excuse slavery.
Right. In America,
we got this problem here. How do we cover for it? Oh, I got it. That's why.
Right. So I'm not a fan of the whole concept, but if you're going to go with that, you can see how people naturally cluster by the racial identities. And that is a big part of why all crime is intrafamiliar. So black people are more likely to kill black people, white people are more likely to kill white people, blah, blah, blah. That's just because it's the things that you associate with the things that are familiar around you. And you're more aggressive and more violent in those familiar territories. So police are not an exception to this rule, and I don't know why they are treated as such. Black cops are more violent towards black people. White cops are more violent towards white people. If you want to have a racial concept of minimizing police use of force, you would have all black cops in white neighborhoods and all white cops in black neighborhoods, because you would be, that goes against human nature to break the intrafamiliar crime barrier.
Yeah, or some, yeah, I guess, yes. It used to be joked that you should have everybody from China move into the neighborhood because they don't care anything about any of you.
Right. So they're going to be as unbiased as anyone can be. Right.
So interesting point. Let me go. I'm going to throw some the chats in here just to keep that going. Let me see. I don't think police brutality is an issue. Yes, there are bad cops, but I think we probably have the smallest percentage of bad apples in this nation's history. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree with that last part. Policing has dramatically improved over the last 5 years when it comes to the raw numbers of use of force. At the same time, the population has gone up by about 2 to 3 million per year. And on top of that, the amount of violence in most of these cities has gone up to tens to triple digit percentages. Oh, so really? If you look at it through that lens, policing has dramatically improved over the last 5 or 6 years when it comes to use of forces, especially when it comes to killings, because killings is really the only data point we really have to go off of. Everything else is kind of subjective. It's not real. Bodies is all we have as a solid number. So when it comes to violence, I'm going to base everything off of murder stats. And when it comes to crimes, I'm going to tell you, we actually just really have no idea how many crimes and the percentages of crimes at any time. A crime is a measurement of police activity, not citizen activity. It's when someone called the police or the police saw something and a crime was alleged, and then they determined and agreed and wrote a report and submitted it, which was approved by supervisors, then eventually sent to the FBI and counted as a crime. But I mean, to think that there's more drug possession in Baltimore than there is on Wall Street is just probably not true at all.
That's fair. And that makes me think too, somebody has brought up before, and I was like, oh, good point, that, when we question how smart or dumb criminals are, it's like, well, you're only looking at the ones who are caught.
Right. And pretty much you can only catch the dumb ones.
Right. And so, I mean, the same thing with the crime. The only crime we know is what is actually enforced. I'll say enforced to cover that too, because I'm sure that sometimes it's like end of the shift and it's not that big of a deal and whatever.
Sure. And it gets even more complicated than that when you think about something like what Martin O'Malley did in Baltimore, where he came into office and then went back to old crimes, upgraded them. So like if it was an ag assault, he would be like, no, 2 people were shot or something. That's 2 ag assaults. So he made the past numbers look higher. And then when he came in and pressured everyone else to downgrade reports, that's another thing that messes up a lot of report stats, is that people think that what someone's convicted of is what they did. And it's almost always way less than what they actually did.
True. So, and that's actually come up too with some of the reform in prison. Now, I'm not going to say that there isn't reform needed, but I hear a lot of these nonviolent crimes. And it's like, well, technically speaking, sometimes that's the only thing that they could get them on in a sequence of events. Like that's the deal that they made. Or am I incorrect on that?
No, I mean, that's a big reason why police officers tend to fight to keep like something like cannabis illegal. They know that cannabis isn't a big deal. They know that minor traffic violations aren't a big deal, but they're legal windows that you generally use to pursue violent offenders. Now, if you come and, there are always going to be brown clowns and highway mountie guys that go out there and corrupt cities and they write traffic tickets, essentially being tax collectors. But I mean, in a city like Baltimore, you're not a tax collector. You're out there fighting crime. And those things are like traffic stops are almost never to give somebody a ticket. They're for getting into the vehicle and looking for things that would lead to violent crime.
Okay. And let me see. I don't know what to think of this. I want drunk driving reform. I want the blood alcohol level raised back to a sane level of 0.1, and I want all drunk driving penalties reduced. Okay. I think that's probably beyond your control.
Yeah, and not that, as I say, those are things that I would argue about. If you're a society and you decide you want to do those things, I would argue with you about the pros and cons of those things, but I think ultimately they're your decisions. I mean, I would certainly not subscribe to decriminalizing driving under the influence.
Yeah, it is. I do wonder about that. Let me see. Triple Crown writes, I've lived in poor white hoods and police are as brutal as we see in the news. The problem is a lack of respect and or expectations of violence in poor hoods, regardless of race or sex.
Yes.
Yeah,
without question. And this kind of culture of violence in any of those instances is certainly a real thing. If someone goes out there and watches The Wire, that's Baltimore. That's Baltimore as I know it still.
So it is accurate then.
Yeah, very much so. These things that you see on TV of like this glamorized version or of this modern version that I'm sure I'm going to strike people the wrong way, but this modern version of the effeminate black male is infuriating coming from somebody on the streets. Like I never knew anybody that sold drugs or was a banger on the streets or lived in the hood that would be whining about how white people are keeping them down. Like I just never heard something like that on the street.
Yeah, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Let me see. Camille, read White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg. I don't know if you've read that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Great book about the history of classism in this country. Cool. Let me see. Cops in Tombstone seem way more oriented to be peace officers versus Phoenix's law enforcement. Is that just a feature of a big city? So living with their neighbors doesn't have a positive effect?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would generally say is you're often going to find sheriffs in these neighborhoods, and a sheriff is an organizational system much more closely aligned to the community than a municipality whose only interest is going to be within the 4 to 8 year window of that individual mayor or governor or whomever.
Is that because the sheriff is elected? Right.
The sheriff is elected and has to answer to his people. I don't think that is the best system. That's not what I would advocate for. But considering our current selections, I think it's vastly superior.
Well, actually, and I was thinking about this, and I want to put it out there. It's like, I would argue we probably agree with that things are pretty bad in Baltimore and have been for a long time, and Chicago areas, and not everywhere, but there are areas that are known for being bad. You've done a ton of research and business studies and everything else. Where are they getting it right?
In policing?
Yes, as close or as close as possible. Or who's doing it the best out of what's there?
No, everybody's doing it exactly the same. And what happens is some communities are different. So it's like when people point to the Netherlands as these examples of some kind of reform that they want. I am never interested in a homogenous community and how things work out there.
Right.
If everyone is, in some rural area in North Dakota where everyone agrees that they should be able to have their shotgun and walk to the store and they have a certain culture and cordiality to them, nothing's going to happen in those kind of cultures. So when it comes to what policing tactics should be, I'm always going to gravitate to the cities so that we can see what they're like when you're dealing with diverse communities and different interests butting their heads.
And the pressure cooker of population on top of each other.
Right. So that's where I'm going to find techniques that really matter. And I don't think policing can, I think basically at this point, police can keep the lid on things, and they can, because they're essentially, it sounds weird to say it, but they are a tyrannical force that is a comply or die thing. So we are the line that when society can move it up or down, but we're the line where everybody says this is where it ends, and we're not going to go beyond that. So I generally want to change that concept of what that is to only when the violence is needed, and everything else would be other issues. The police are just the lid. They're just, when you're like, okay, as a community, you say to yourselves, okay, we cannot handle this situation. Well, that's when violence needs to come in. Violence does have to come in from time to time,
Sure,
to quell a situation. And I just, people like me love kicking in doors. I love locking people up and raiding a house and sorting through all their shit and trying to make a complaint. But you don't unleash me on the general public. Does that make sense? You know,
no, it totally does. But
anything that minimizes us is what I want to talk about. We should be minimizing our influence in anything that is not violence related. You do not need violence as the response for something like a traffic ticket or a parking ticket or your kid not going to school on time. It's those issues that I think are the primary issue that the civilians and general community should be looking for. And as police officers, we should be looking for professional ways to constantly improve our jobs. Like anything else, we should be finding out what causes crime. For instance, if there's a bank robbery, modern policing everywhere pretty much in the world, I have not found an exception, will investigate how the crime occurred, what led up to the crime, what went down during the crime, and then who they're going to exact revenge on as a society and incarcerate and or kill that person. Well, that's not doing anything to figure out how to not make the next burglary occur. And if police,
well, now there were, out of curiosity though, is that the police job, or is that actually I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because the bank has their internal security and things of that sort. And I promise you that bank is internally going, okay, well, this happened here and this happened here. So if we structure this in a certain way, that's going to prevent that from happening quite as easily. Is that the cop's job to do that, or the internally for the bank to do that?
That's the bank's job. I'm interested in what made the individual, the suspects, commit the crime. I need to stop those things. Policing.
But that's not a cop's job either, is it? Because
the
society's ills aren't necessarily your job to fix as a cop. I mean, okay,
it depends what that ill is.
He's a dick and I can't afford to pay my rent and I'm desperate or whatever it is, or I'm just a greedy son of a bitch who wants to buy drugs.
Right. And I get what you're saying when it comes to especially things like violations. We have to make a division between victim crimes and things that are more communal violations. So for communal violations, I can say, yeah, sure, limit the police to enforcement mechanisms and the community can deal with it itself. But basically, there is no way. Would you agree that police should fight crime?
On the base level, yes.
Right. So fighting crime requires understanding what causes it.
Well, first you have to define crime. I think we'd go even further back because, you were saying violations or whatever, tickets and stuff. We may be saying some of that's Mickey Mouse shit, and they shouldn't even. Maybe
should police try to prevent violence?
Right. Okay. Yes, I think that anything to stop actual violence, rape, severe property damage. Yes.
Right. So now in the sciences, no police department is doing this. The reason why the number one cause that we can link, or you can just say correlate to violence, is environmental poisoning. In America, this is going to be most dominated by lead poisoning.
Sure.
And so when you have the lead poisoning, this is what's causing people to be violent. So what happens is a young child growing up in a poor neighborhood or just poorly upkept neighborhood, or something went wrong with the pipes or whatever. This kid is poisoned by a chemical that is illegal to be in these houses. They are poisoned by their landlords and by the neglect of whatever systems are in place that are supposed to be controlling this. This lead enters these children's system and it literally changes their medulla oblongata and makes them be violent and have lower impulse control. They grow up through life and they have trouble learning and they get in trouble as kids but we kind of blame that on the school systems. We look other ways. And then when this individual is the famous 16 to 24-year-old Black male that dominates violence and arrest stats, this is when the individual is powerful enough to hit the stats of real violent crime that it has victims and is exposed to the community. Now that person kills somebody and the police come and they lock that person up, exact revenge on them, and throw away the key. No investigation being done on the fact that this individual was actually poisoned 16 years ago, and that made them this way. Felony poisoning would be vicariously like any other felony. That murder would actually go on the people who poisoned the kid. But we don't draw that line anywhere. This is why the great 90s crime reduction took place in America, is when we took lead out of the air. When we did that, 16 to 20-year delay, you get all the dramatic crime violence reduction in the United States. When New York did this, they fought lead poisoning more than any other city in the nation, and got New York City to the lowest level of lead in the entire nation. And then 16 to 20 years later, they end up being the most crime-free or violence-free city.
More specifically, leaded gasoline too, over everything. Right. That was the
90s. That was the big, huge.
That was the giant driver, not necessarily lead pipes and whatnot. It was the gasoline.
Right, totally. Okay. And so the pipes and the paint and the ground poisoning are very localized environmentally. In New York City, they track it down to the very block. And so if cops were fighting lead poisoning, they would see dramatic reductions in these cities, even Baltimore, Flint. I mean, people talk about Flint. Flint's
but that's not a cop's job. A cop is out to inspect lead pipes. I didn't know that. There was a science. No, I'm saying it's like, maybe I'm dumb. I was a soldier once, and like soldiers are put in to do one thing, and that's to secure an area, whatever. Our job is not necessarily to test the water. Now, there are special fields for that. Okay, maybe. And we might protect a scientist who does, but is that really a cop's job to check the pipes and
No, not to check the pipes. I mean, to do the investigation on what caused the actual incident. Just like, if it's the bank robbery, and come to find out, so there's a famous pedophilia case where come to find out the person had a tumor on their brain. And then once the tumor was removed, there was no pedophilia thoughts remaining, and they let the person go. These things happen throughout all kinds of instances. I'm using lead because it's a dramatic one. And it's usually police shooting victims are also lead poisoning because they're clearly having impulse control problems and not making the right decisions. This would lower the amount of people that police shoot, and would lower the amount of other people shooting other people, especially in these localized areas where the lead poisoning still remains. But yes, it's illegal to poison a child with lead. I would say absolutely. Yes. We follow that chain all the way back, and at least prosecute even if you're not going to prosecute for the murder, you would prosecute for the poisoning.
Sure. I'm not against any of that. Same way as that I believe, occasionally a health inspector going in a restaurant's not a bad thing.
Right. And it doesn't have to be a cop that is actually
enforcing. That's kind of where I'm going, is I'm like,
sure, only use the guns. I want us the police department's already an infrastructure that's very solidly in place. Mm-hmm. So the idea of shifting like funds from the police department to something that doesn't have infrastructure doesn't make sense to me. I would always want to change the police department and just keep armed officers and the ones who go out there and enforce the violence aspects to be a separate division. I envision it like SWAT teams that are always on the ready but don't actually handle calls.
Yeah, really. Well, they should be very rare. And part of my issue, and I can be completely wrong, is I think there's been a persistent militarization of the police over the past decades.
Since like 92 or something like that. When was the North LA Hollywood shootout? Right
about then, 91, right. 92. And then the riots. But actually, even before that, the Sudanese Liberation Army, when they shot that house up. Mm-hmm. That was Daryl Gates, if I recall. His big thing was the SWAT, and that was a full-on military deal, and they put that into effect. I had somebody on the show who's very, very, very strong lefty, and he loves to talk about how evil the police were in LA and Ronald Reagan, and so he takes it all the way back to the late 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. I think it's running rampant because, honestly, I've said it 1,000 times, I never feel intimidated when a bicycle cop's around. I'm just saying, I don't. And I don't think most people do. And part of it is they're talking to me and they look like a normal person.
Sure.
It's a much more comfortable encounter. They're just as powerful as any other cop. They have a radio. So as long as there's a radio, that's all the power you can imagine. should we consider moving toward some of that? And that's leading into a question from Eva here too. What happened with the civilian-led policing strategy you were advocating for several years back? Have you changed your mind about the civilians being involved?
Oh, no, I haven't changed my mind whatsoever. I still find that the civilian-led model that I developed is the best model that I can come up with. I haven't seen a better one be presented. And that's based off of basic business management principles where you are creating essentially a board and aligning your values to the community as best as we can. The civilian-led model is a rotating board of like jury pool selected type people on the board. And there's all these balancing mechanisms we could always go through, but that's boring, tedious stuff. But the whole point is to take actual people that are invested in the community and have them be the essentially board of directors, and you have a CEO working for them for all the reasons that this is shown to be effective in aligning shareholder theories with modern businesses. And all, almost every publicly traded company that you see is doing this right now. Exxon is maximizing their profits for their shareholders using this exact same model. And I just want to use those type of models to maximize the bond between the invested shareholders in the community and in the actual police departments. And it never gains any foot, no matter how we went, because we're disrupting the power structure that exists where the governors and mayors see the police as their personal thing. And I think there's a huge problem with the community actually wanting to take responsibility for the police actions.
Okay, so that's it's kind of an oversight. And it's interesting you just said that about the government and governors and mayors. But then earlier you said that sometimes the sheriffs aren't as poisonous.
Right, the sheriff can potentially stay longer than the 8 years. The governor and mayor has no interest beyond 8 years.
Okay, and the sheriff does report to the people. I mean,
right.
Her ass will be thrown out, or not elected. And
yeah, so you have special elections; they're bad enough, sure.
Right, versus the police being appointed by a mayor, so they are beholden to that same mayor. A sheriff is not necessarily as beholden to the county supervisor or whomever is involved.
Exactly. And that's who they end up serving. And most of the time when you see boards where people talk about police supervision boards, they're always appointed by the governor or by the city council. They're not actually from the people. They're all fallacious nonsense that just end up being a power struggle. But I've really found traveling the nation that almost all police reformers are just thinking that if they're in charge of the police, then everything will be fine. And they're almost entirely ignorant on anything to do with policing or what's actually effective or what causes violence.
Okay, well, here's somebody pushing back on that, actually. England has implemented community support officers. The theory is good, but has changed nothing. Do you think educating the people could be equally as important as training the police?
Sure, you can take that perspective as a community. I will not advocate for that. I will always advocate for my team doing a better job and not placing blame elsewhere.
Okay.
So, I mean, England still fails. They're still in the revenge model. Almost everybody is on the revenge model. So when you see even somebody that wants to go out there and protest policing and how policing is bad, dude, the first thing they do is call for the police and want the police to come lock that person up and put them in the jail through the same system they argued was evil the entire time. All they wanted to do was be in power of it. Sure. I'm not interested in those arguments or me being in power. I'm interested in aligning the community to be the one that's in charge of and that means with that power, they have to take the responsibility of this. Big problem that I talk about a lot is the difference between communal ethics and individual ethics. So if we should be expecting the officer to do an ethical behaviors or act morally as determined by the community, not by themselves as an individual. Currently, our law says that however the police feel, their individual ethics are what determine whether they can pull the trigger and kill another citizen or not. I entirely disagree with that. Those rules and those conditions lie in the hands of the community. But when the police officer does everything that the community asks, when they follow their use of force structure, when they use the commands that the community asks them to use, and it goes bad and somebody dies, that blame is on the community. It is not on revenge seeking for the officer.
Okay, yeah, and I did want to go into that because.
And while you're talking, I just have to change make sure my battery's not going to die, but I can hear you entirely.
it puts you in a quandary, I feel, where you may have policy, but an officer has to be able to report against something, and they have to understand what it is. And yes, it's good to have morals and ethics, and we all want them. But sometimes you have to have something in black and white, especially when things get gray, because I can't imagine anything being more gray than what you were looking out there in the world. So if there is a set of procedures and policies, and the officer does follow those procedures and policies, to lock them up after the fact doesn't seem quite right either. Because how are they, they can't, we're not living in Minority Report, are we?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So these things aren't going to be perfect, and it's just not about finding a way to use violence as your thing as deterrence. Violence by the state is not a deterrence for violence by the citizens. We have seen this tested over and over and over again. Just because you're the one exacting the violence doesn't mean anything's going to change. You're just going to make the opponent also respond in violence, because that's aggression. That's the key difference that I always want to talk about between violence and aggression. There is violence, and all violence, from everything I can understand, is a biological malfunction. It is something going wrong with somebody on a temporary or even longer term status. If you're lead poisoning, obviously that's a lifelong biological malfunction that you're going to have. You can also have temporary ones where somebody just freaks out and they're like, oh, I can't believe that guy did that. Well, you probably can't believe he did it either. And then there's aggression, which is when somebody, like an act of war, or when somebody's coming after you. If you're a drug dealer and the baddest guy on the street says that he's going to kill you and put the word out on the street, and you kill him first, that's not violence. That's aggression. That's trying to survive. Those are very different things that, when I talk about the police investigating, part of that needs to be, is this an act of aggression or is this an act of violence? Those are very different things.
That gets very difficult for, I hate to say, the beat cop to sort out.
Sure. I don't think that's the beat cop's job. I think that this is the elite detectives who are tried and true, have access to resources. This is not, the beat cop's going to do the same thing that they've been doing all the time. They don't have to sort this out. This is something for further along prosecutors and detectives.
But isn't it technically the beat cops that people are protesting against?
Yeah, good point. I have a problem with that, because you are protesting against the servant, not the master. And that's bewildering. I mean, the patrol cop is the lowest guy on the police department totem pole. He's just following orders, trying to make a paycheck and get home safely to his family. There are people, and you know their names, and you vote for them, who are ordering these people to do these things, and you blame the pawn. That's kind of mind-blowing.
No, we have that too. We hate Congress, but keep voting in our same Congress people.
Right. I mean,
that's a
obviously a lot of this is all tied together with the political aspect and what policing is, because politicians are in charge of policing, and it is not the average citizen. The closest that comes is with a sheriff, but you're still absolved in politics. He's still got to appeal to mob rule, to democracy. And of course, you talk to me, and I'm going to be adamantly against mob rule and democracy. This is a constitutional republic for a reason, because it protects the minority. Constitutional republics protect the minority. Let's say it 1,000 times over again. We should not be talking about, just because the vast majority of the people agree on something, that's what we should do. We need to have basic principles and communally defined morals that sustain beyond the immediate moment.
Okay. Let me see, from Gavin here is from England, so it's cool to get a perspective, from a different country. CSOs, or hobby bobbies, as their, I guess it's community service officers, or hobby bobbies, as
they call them bobbies when they walk around. This is what we call them.
Right. Well, bobbies are cops. I guess hobby bobbies are kind of anyway. As they're nicknamed, are a helping hand. They don't seem to have any huge impact on society that couldn't be achieved by regular police anyway.
I'm not saying regular police can't achieve something that we should disarm them for. One of our issues is that human beings are emotional creatures, and the vast majority of them have a flight, fight, or freeze response. And that fight, flight, or freeze is something that we do not want armed people going through. In the military, from my units that I was in the Marine Corps, and the training that I've seen demonstrated throughout there and through policing, I do not believe that the military or police are actually training officers to control their behavior in these moments. I think these steps and trainings are actually ways to weed out who has this genetic predisposition to not respond in a fight, flight, or freeze. This is just why in shootings, for school shootings, most school shootings are stopped by an unarmed teacher physically wrestling or talking the gun out of the shooter. And that is because that person has no training, but they didn't fight, flight, or freeze. They kept a clear mind and went through things rationally. I don't think that there are physically enough people to actually create the armed officer thing that we envision and carry that out successfully. And it's not a matter of training, and it gets into some weird genetic stuff, but plenty of cops do the whole fight, flight, or freeze. And that's why you're sitting there going, I can't believe this happened. Well, that person is just not in a sane state of mind.
I hate to say this too. There is a particular type of person who doesn't, or often doesn't like
psychopath. Yes,
exactly. I would also.
So you call me a psychopath because I don't fight, flight, or freeze? Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Or on the autism spectrum. They're not quite.
Yes, I could be there too. I understand.
So yes, and well, and I would argue that there's actually a genetic, or not genetic, but evolutionary reason for a psychopath.
Oh,
It
yeah.
exists for a reason.
Okay, I want to hear.
There's a need. I mean, well, it's one of those hard subjects, but yes, there are friendly psychopaths, whatever.
Sure. I mean, the vast majority are. I mean, that is why, the vast majority of CEOs and companies are probably on the psychopath scale, and they're not out there murdering people.
It's also been argued that Gandhi and Nelson Mandela may both have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. Such a mindset that's not emotionally driven would also be able to think more clearly in situations where you would expect people not to.
Right. But then that does lead into why they try to weed out that particular fight or flight, because a lot of times they cross over. It may not be, somebody may not be, fully all in the hair exam, but let's just say that the closer that they get to the edge, the probably more effective they are in a stressful situation.
Right. I would like us to see a type of people like that. I don't want to say us because maybe we just classified that, but as necessary evils,
himself, folks. No.
Right? We're necessary evils that society has to have, because some people will have a tumor in their brain that causes them to go out and be schizophrenic and envision killing a whole bunch of people and then gathering the things to do it. You need someone that's going to come in clear-headed and kill that person for you. I mean, you pretty much pay the police to kill for you. You pay the military to kill for you. You guys have spent millions of dollars training me to be an effective mercenary, and then you kind of expect me not to be a mercenary? That doesn't really make sense to me. You should just be controlling where you use me. And the idea that I was a good cop by all measurable metrics is a weird thing, actually, like for me to conceptualize. I mean, I feel a little devious in my ways certain times, like I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, and the idea that I was good at that and I'm giving you what you want. I mean, I don't know. What does that really say about the job?
Well, I don't know if you ever heard the Patton saying, but he was saying essentially the great soldiers are the ones that are, break glass in case of war.
Right. I totally see that same way. Yeah.
But there's nowhere for them to go outside of it. And that
right. That's why it's cool if you just pay us to train. Like if it's a SWAT team, you can take us weirdos and we can train. That's what we did in the Marine Corps. The most dangerous thing is a bored Marine. So you're either training or you're doing. And us type of people are perfectly happy doing that.
Well, that's good to hear. But then how are you dealing with the rest of it? So it's like using this methodology, everything has to be reformed in one way or another. You still need that point of contact.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's a very slow mission of slowly pulling cops back and testing things. I mean, essentially, I'm only going off of the data, looking at different, there are other countries that when they pull you over, they don't have an armed officer and how things respond. Of course, everything in America is very different. This is the only place where you have a First Amendment right and a Second Amendment right. Nowhere in the whole world does this combination exist. Mm-hmm. So police here are going to be more afraid than police everywhere else. And I guess we really structured this society that's the way we wanted it to be.
We actually, technically, when the country was built, authority was supposed to be a little afraid.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So, I mean, this is part of the thing we set up. And is it worth roughly 1,000 people, roughly 30 of them unarmed, being killed by the police for that amount of liberty and for something unique in the world? I think for the most part, our country has decided that absolutely 1,000 people is worth that cost.
Yeah, but which 1,000? I mean, yeah, we all can believe in Jefferson that the tree of liberty has to be fed with blood every once in a while, but then it's like, okay, but whose blood? And we're going through that. We're going through that right now, even. Let me see. John Paxton is asking, what are the problems with having a cop with a mental health professional respond together? Colorado appeared to have success with, but does that model travel? I think it'd be hard to scale.
I think it's getting very expensive, and you have to understand that these things are on a delay. You can't. People do this all the time with doctors. They're like, well, just hire more doctors. You can't just hire more doctors. There's all kinds of things.
10 to 12 years.
Right. So you can make a huge investment in it right now, and maybe 12 years from now, this investment of yours will pay off. Maybe, I don't, and we'll have to see, but I think communities should commit to something like that. But the idea of having some kind of instant payoff is just not going to happen. And I think that's why areas like Baltimore get stuck in these cycles. And literally what happens is crime rises more, and it's weird. I always mean violence. I don't want to point out crime. Crime is just an ambiguous kind of thing that doesn't really make any sense. It requires too much nuance. So violence happens, and then people get frustrated with it and they want a quick reaction. So then they build up the police to be even tougher, more militarized. They go out and crack heads and lock people up, and that will knock violence down. Literally a strategy we had in the police department was, if you lock up these guys and put them in jail, they can't be killed that night. So good job on you. I mean, that's quite corrupt in my opinion, but that is an actual tactic that goes out, and on paper, this will be very effective. But then those people come out of a criminal justice system, the conditions actually worsen, so they come out, and then the violence rates go up. And then we invest more in the community, in a policing department that will lock people up and be aggressive, and it will clean up the streets in this temporary fashion. And we just keep going through this loop over and over again. And we have to, at some point in time, invest in a longer term vision.
Yeah, and I've talked to cops before who straightened me out, and they said, "Oh, we don't stop crime; we just move it."
Yeah, that is absolutely true. That's like, because you're only that's what the incentives. That's why I went into a business management PhD and evolved from that, from a criminal justice bachelor, because I started to see that this was all managerial and organizational issues. This didn't have anything to do with the frontline employee assembling his product. This had to do with the entire way of things were structured. I was working for a police department where the biggest line item on the entire city's budget is the police department, and it was being led by a cop with a GED. Dude, that's never going to work out. It's just never going to work out. We're not going to be able to set up incentives and disincentives for human behavior that will result in the things we want. We just can't dictate how people will act. The incentives and disincentives in their jobs will literally define how they act.
I got to push on that too, because I've been in the corporate world, the business world too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a stating that what you can measure, you can manage. That's one of those.
You can manipulate.
That's one of those two-factor things. Like I always joke that you can take the same statement and say it twice, and it's both a positive and a negative. Like,
sure.
With my job, I'm able to work remotely and from home. With my job, I'm able to work remotely and from home. So it's okay, I have the freedom to work from home. Oh, I can always work from home and never escape it. So same sentence, same
Right.
problem. Well, let's take that thing, and that's where I'm going to push back a little bit on the building the system and everything else. Is that if you can measure it, you can manage it. If you get it to where you're lock it down to this particular system or number or metrics, I despise metrics.
Me too.
Then you're actually going to start manipulating everything to fit into those metrics. And I think some of the problems that exist now, you've almost implied, are following this. Like,
totally agree. We're not in disagreement.
Okay. So how do you avoid that with your structural requirement? Because again, you've got to report back. Well, I've done X, fill in the blank.
Right. So quantitative ones that you're talking about are almost always going to be manipulated. I'm talking about more basic incentives. Like when a cop makes an arrest in Baltimore, the +1 good job is that they made an arrest. Well, that can't be your +1 good job that they made an arrest. There should at least be a conviction, something simple like that. Or at the end of the shift. So they'll cut overtime, but there's a rule that the primary officer is the one that sticks with the case. So if I want to make overtime at any day of the week, when I was a sergeant working patrol, I could have done this any single day. I wait until about 5 minutes before the end of the shift. I can lock up anybody I choose to lock up. And then I'm making about $72 an hour to drag my ass processing that arrest. So we've done 4 very bad things there. We've put somebody in prison that had probably no business being in prison. We wasted the court system. There's going to be definitely a trial set up. There's going to be assistant prosecutors and public defenders involved. That I'm going to go to booking, waste all their time, which was a state agency for us, so it wasn't even our agency. And then I'm going to waste taxpayers' money lining my pockets because of these simple things that we can easily change that encourage bad behavior and discourage normal behavior. So there's all kinds of little things like that in policing that I would argue about tweaking in these nuances.
Isn't the reverse true, though, at the same time? Isn't the reverse true at the same time? Like, I get that call, and it's only 5 minutes till, and I just say, screw it. I just don't have time to deal with it. And now violence occurs. We'll leave out crime, but violence occurs because I just didn't feel like doing it right now. I was toward the end of the shift. So I totally agree. You're right about wasting all the resources, but then you have the reverse. So how do you tread that line to be effective going both ways?
Yeah, I think you have to take every single situation and you have to judge it. So basically, I would argue with you that say, yes, you could say that you would disincentivize that, but more what we're talking about is cops being money. Most of the issue is going to be money. They can't avoid a crime of violence. They have to prosecute that. And you can switch that person off. When I say a primary, it has to be on view. So it's when the cop is making the decision, not when the suspect is making the decision. So if somebody robs a store, that can actually be handed off. But if I lock you up for jaywalking, that could not be handed off. Things like that. But that's just a nuance to that particular case. So every single city, every jurisdiction, county, state, whatever, is going to have different rules and uniquenesses about this. I wholly believe that these are your decisions to make. And you say to me, well, what about this scenario? What do we do here? And I tell you a couple of things, but then you make your own decisions based upon what you want. I do not, fundamentally, I am a servant, even if that's as the CEO of your police department. You make the rules, not me.
Okay. And what do you do with those who abdicate their responsibility? Like, say, Congress, I mentioned earlier. Anyway, that's a loaded topic. I want to change subjects for the last few minutes because we're running short on it, and address, we've got just pure madness going on right now at the Capitol. How would you, as a police commander, leader, pick your rank, whatever, somebody who has influence, how would you recommend tackling this current situation?
Well, one thing I will say about today's events, or January 6th, is that the Capitol Police are by far the best riot control police I've ever seen in action. So I they're so good at it that if I heard a case where that somebody was trying to say they did something terrible I would totally not believe them. That's a well-trained police department when it comes to those things. So I'm sure whatever they're doing, they're weighing things out very appropriately. The biggest problem I would argue with when it comes to protesting from a tactical point of view. Now, as a society point of view, these are your arguments and you do what you want and I'll just do it for you. But from my perspective, things like protesting and rioting must be stamped out immediately. A lot of people are surprised when they hear me say that. But if you were if you were rioting in my city, I would crush that within minutes.
Well, you first separate protest versus riot, right?
Sure. As soon as there's a moment of violence, a moment.
Tickets going and no, I hate this. Yell.
Yeah. Whatever. Go yell. I might not even be there. I just might stay back. Generally, I think the best policy is to stay back. And the moment violence occurs, then you crush it immediately. And that's like probably my one zero tolerance kind of position that I would take is when you're talking about the mob, because policing is an illusion. Societal control is an illusion. Money is an illusion. These things only work as far as we buy into them. And I know my ability to stop the mob is very limited window. And it's a short window of immediacy. They've already let these things get so far that you're kind of getting into I don't really know what you do when you fuck up this badly. I feel like a lot of people come to me for advice when they've already messed up so bad. It's like, well, if you would have listened to what I would have said 5 years ago, you probably wouldn't be in this boat.
So there's no Chopper or Chaz in your...
There's not going to be one in Baltimore or like Detroit ever. That would be stomped down so fast. And there wouldn't be one in any city I was running by any means. I've definitely changed my position on a lot of these things. It's kind of like religion. I was very hard against religion in the past, but I think I clearly see now that whether it's right or not, like nationalism too, that I would be the one that didn't stand for the flag because I thought that was the American thing to do, to be the rebel of the bunch. Mm-hmm. But without those things, what ties somebody from California to somebody from Maryland? What ties us in these mutual goals? It has to be this sense of nationalism. And even if it's like religion or something like that, these bonds give people from different areas something in common and like a common view of where to go. And I feel like over the last 5 years, we have very much worked towards creating more us versus thems and destroying the things that make us a communal bond.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's interesting you brought that up about the states and things. You were a Marine, and when I was in the Army, and people don't realize that, at least in the Army, you could say anything you want about somebody's mother. Nobody gives a shit. But if you talk about
say some things too, boy, we will say some things about what we did to your mother.
Exactly. But if you talk about somebody's home state, that's war.
Right.
And it's a very weird, especially if it's Puerto Rico, which I know is not a state.
Sure.
But don't talk about Puerto Rico. They're very protective. So it's like Puerto Rico and then Texas and then kind of everybody else. But it's sort of an oddity. And I'm thinking that the military, one thing it's actually, military is best at burying people. Nobody's better at handling bodies in the military. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, crushing people into a single environment to where it's like, yeah, you've got your states, but you're still a Marine. You're still Army.
Right.
While you're here. I don't know where I'm going with that. I guess.
Well, I mean, you did the same thing. All soldiers bleed green. I'm sure you say it just like the Marines did. We didn't allow racism. We didn't allow these divisions to get in. We would only allow things like states, which is kind of like team rivals. You think about my NFL team and we can get in a little fist fight over it and mess around, but it's nothing that's really serious. We're ultimately united by this common bond. And I really feel kind of saddened that common bond has broken down. And being somebody that's from Arizona and from the hood in Baltimore, I can tell you that the Black people that you see talking about police reform and whatever politicians and all are not remotely aligned with the beliefs, opinions, and desires of people in the hood. And I feel the same.
Dude, I live in Hampton, which is a majority Black community.
Right, in Puerto Rico and all.
Yeah, and nobody talks like that shit.
Not at all.
And most of, I hate to say, a lot of BLM is white.
Yes, or privileged essentially living in what would be the white class or white supremacy, the way they envision it. They're actually from that class and group. The whole classic neoliberal, Malcolm X, you can go back and watch Malcolm X talk about the neoliberal. He warned us about this a long time ago, and I'm sure he'd be like, see, I told you, those are the wolves in sheep's clothing that are coming in to destroy everything. And there's certainly a lot of truth to that's seen in the breaking down, even clustering. Like, it bothers me that the Mexicans here in Arizona are kind of clustered into this oppressed group that would be anti-American. And I know all these people, I obviously live with them, and they're nothing but hardworking Americans that are super proud to be here, super proud of their family. They go to church every weekend. And when my ass doesn't stand up for that flag, they're giving me dirty looks. It's a total.
Well, here's an irony.
Reality is totally different.
Okay, now that you live in Arizona, here's an irony that people don't realize. Nobody hates an illegal more
than illegal.
I'm not kidding.
It's true. That's why I can finish the sentence.
It is. And people don't. And people sit there and they think that it's like, oh yeah, all the Mexicans here are going to love. No, they do not like it. They don't like it at all. It is a really ugly scenario. And I'm not as into the neighborhoods or anything like that, but I imagine they feel the same way about some of the leaders, if you will, who are speaking for them.
Absolutely, they do.
Quote unquote.
Same thing with the Black communities in Baltimore. It's the same way. It's the same way here. And as being somebody that's actually from the street, from poor, Section 8 housing, I feel really weird when I'm in these circles where I was for a long time in kind of the far left circles of media, and everybody would just be talking like they never even been to these places. They know nothing of these people, and they're like showing up to protests and riots for like these fake weird causes that they imagined in their head that aren't happening in reality.
Yeah, and I'll go one more. You're in Arizona. I think you're part Native American. If you go to a tribe and you meet somebody and you ask them what they are, what do they say?
If I meet somebody here?
If you meet somebody that's in a tribal nation, what do they call themselves?
Oh, it would depend on the tribal one, but almost everybody just says they're American.
No, they do, or they just say I'm an Indian.
Yeah.
Ironically speaking,
they'll say American Indian.
They don't say American Indian. They don't say Native. They just say, yeah, I'm an Indian. And that's the hard part to get through to a lot of people. It's like, no, it's not even racist. It's like, have you talked to anybody there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's so common that I didn't even think about it. I mean, that's just, like you said, it's just what they say. And they would say their tribe if you really wanted to go further into it. But like another example there is when you talk about the flag. I mean, I kind of had this face, to me, I always kind of viewed it as just, to me, like, I guess I'm the British are coming, burn authority at pretty much almost all times. Okay. Probably more aligned with libertarians. But when I would be somebody that would, like, to most Native Americans, especially the ones, the Navajos and the Sioux, who participate very heavily in the military, that flag represents this land. It does not represent the causes that liberals were associated with it. And the idea that you don't respect the flag to them is extremely offensive, because you're talking about the land that their ancestors fought and died for, the wars that their code talkers helped won, and that they continue to shed blood to protect this land the way it is. The idea that you don't respect the flag is a great insult to them from an entirely different perspective than we're generally talking about.
Sure, and it's not just the land, but with the Indian Native American culture, the land is of the people.
Right.
So when they say, because land is ephemeral to them. You know,
right. It's them.
We're owned by the land.
Like, what do you mean? You're not standing for us? You're not burning us? Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Let me see. I'm going to close out with Eva, because she put this together.
Yes. Good job, Eva.
Eva's a rock star and definitely is a fan of your show. So be looking out for her. What does Dr. Wood think about decriminalizing drugs and other nonviolent offenses? Would that make it easier or harder for the police to do their job in terms of stopping violence?
So personally, this is like getting into my opinion. My opinion is for complete legalization and regulation. I don't believe that any non-victim crimes should be something that the state is enforcing with violence. And I think the record is clear. Like, for instance, you used to be able to buy heroin, pure heroin, right out of the Montgomery Ward catalog and mail order it. The idea that these things are illegal is actually very new. And society was quite fine when they were legal. We understood the purity levels. I mean, essentially, overdoses are not overdoses. There are poisonings through fentanyl. And like, overdoses drop, the cost drops dramatically, and usage actually drops. It's the same thing that you can watch right now with cannabis, is that when things become legal, youth participation actually drops off. So it's a very counterintuitive thing, and I understand that. But cops will continue to fight for it because it's a window into people's lives. And as a cop, yeah, I want windows into your lives. That's my job. As a citizen, I want to limit every window that the police get. And I, even when we may feel uncomfortable with those windows, and then just remember that we're kind of being on the side of state violence for someone's choice. And I just can't go with that.
Perfect. Well, that's a great place to finish. And I don't know, I think we covered a lot of ground, really.
We did for an hour. I would say that this is the best, most effective ground I've ever covered with some narrowed questions. We sometimes will go off into my fright, flight, or freeze and lack of free will and all kinds of shit like that. I think this went great. And anytime anybody else has more questions after viewing this, I'd come on and answer other questions as well.
Fantastic. And please, folks, if you have questions, comment section, hit up the comments. I'm always hoping to see what you think. If you think Mike is completely on point, cool. If he's off his rocker, that's even better to start the controversy. But please consider subscribing if you like this type of content. And thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.